As one of the most important events of the American Revolutionary War, Washington's crossing of the Delaware late on Christmas Day of 1776 helped raise the spirits of colonists and bolstered his soldiers' morale heading into winter encampments. What led to Washington's desperate move? Who participated in the short battles that followed? And why was the result so important? Stick around and find out on the inaugural video of 10-Minute History. In the summer of '76, British troops landed in New York and began pushing the Continental Army back. Washington and the Army avoided annihilation in late August when they were able to escape across the Hudson River under fog and darkness. The British were stunned when the fog lifted mid-morning, revealing an abandoned enemy camp. The Continental Army was chased through New Jersey and crossed into Pennsylvania to avoid the British and Hessian pressure. Following Washington's retreat across the Delaware, the British chose to end the campaign season and set up outposts in New Jersey from Perth Amboy to Bordentown, including one at Trenton. Hessian troops were the primary presence in New Jersey at the end of 1776, while British troops returned to New York for winter quarters. Washington's army was made up of 4,000 to 6,000 men, but at least 1,500 were unfit for duty, requiring hospital care. General Horatio Gates was unable to join Washington due to weather-related delays, and General Charles Lee declined to follow Washington's orders to join his troops. In addition, Washington faced many expiring enlistments. Due to poor morale and the apparent bleak outlook for the revolutionary cause, many of these soldiers were inclined to leave the army after their enlistments. On December 19th, Thomas Paine's The American Crisis was published, and Washington ordered it read to all of his troops the following day. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Desperate times require desperate measures. Following the capture of General Lee by the British, the reinforcements finally arrived at Washington's camp on December 20th. Washington's army now totaled around 6,000 troops fit for duty, but the number available for action against the British and Hessian forces was less than half of this. After considering his options, Washington announced the plan to cross the Delaware and attack Trenton on December 23rd. The date chosen for the offensive was to be the early morning of the 26th. Washington ordered the troops to ready themselves on the morning of December 25th. Late that afternoon, the troops marched out of camp toward McConkey's Ferry, but arrived about 90 minutes behind schedule. The troops readied the watercraft for the crossing as the weather continued to deteriorate. What started as cold drizzle turned to sleet and then snow as the soldiers waited to cross. Colonel Henry Knox oversaw the logistics of the crossing from McConkey's Ferry and later reported that it was accomplished with almost infinite difficulty. Floating ice presented an especially difficult challenge. Washington was on one of the first boats across the river, and troops quickly formed a sentry line to protect the landing site. Orders were given that no one was to pass through the area. Victory or death was used as the passphrase. Due to the difficulty crossing the river with the ice floe, the artillery did not reach the other side until 3 a.m., well behind the intended target. The troops began to march to Trenton around 4 a.m. The plan originally called for 3 crossings, but the other 2 failed due to the weather and ice floes on the river. As the troops under Washington marched toward Trenton, they were split into 2 columns. The first one was led by Washington and General Greene and broke off to follow Pennington Road a few miles inland from the river. The second one was led by General Sullivan and continued on the river road. The march was grueling, given the weather and lack of supplies for the soldiers. Some of the troops had no shoes and their feet began to bleed. Several men died on the march. Colonel Johann Rall was concerned that Trenton was indefensible and had sought reinforcements, but his request was denied. Rall was warned to be on guard for a possible attack from the Americans and received word that Washington had called for a council of war on December 22nd. Due to the poor weather on the night of December 25th, the Hessians chose not to send out a patrol. The Hessian force totaled about 1,500 men. During the fight that followed, 3 Americans were killed and 6 wounded. The Hessians suffered 22 killed and 98 wounded. The Americans captured an estimated 1,000 soldiers, along with guns, artillery, and ammunition. In addition to this, much-needed provisions were also captured, including meats, flour, ale, along with boots, clothing, and bedding. One of the 9 American casualties was fellow founding father and future American president James Monroe, who suffered a shoulder wound and nearly died. Rall was mortally wounded during the battle, dying later that night. Although often mentioned in history books and films, the Hessian soldiers were not drunk from Christmas celebrations the previous evening. Following the battle, the American forces were required to cross the river a second time. In addition to carrying their own supplies, they also had to transport the Hessian prisoners. Complicating the matter, some of the American soldiers had celebrated the victory by drinking captured rum and were now drunk. A number of troops had to be pulled from the icy waters as a result. The victory at Trenton and subsequent victories at Assunpink Creek and Princeton had significant effects upon the morale of the Continental Army, Congress, and the public at large. As the Army entered winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey, a renewed enthusiasm for the war effort had been gained. An often overlooked aspect of the crossing and resulting battles is the number of individuals who played a role and would later become important contributors to the early United States. Besides George Washington and James Monroe, Alexander Hamilton, John Marshall, and Arthur St. Clair all played roles as well. Let's finish this video by looking at a few trivia questions or interesting facts regarding the crossing of the Delaware. How many of the 3 planned river crossings for the attack were successful? The answer? 1. The main force led by Washington managed the crossing, but was about 3 hours behind schedule. About how wide was the river at the site of the crossing? Although often portrayed as wider in movies and paintings, the site of the crossing was approximately 300 yards wide. Who was given command of the river crossing operation? Colonel Henry Knox. Knox would later become the first U.S. Secretary of War. Which future president was wounded during the ensuing Battle of Trenton? James Monroe. He reportedly suffered a severed artery and nearly died from the wound. What was the secret passphrase used during the crossing? Victory or death. Troops would use victory as the password, with or death being the response. Finally, how old was Washington at the time of the crossing? George Washington was 44 years old when he crossed the Delaware River. Thanks for watching the video, and please don't forget to like and subscribe below. Leave me a comment as well, and let me know what topics you would like to see covered next on 10 Minute History.